Welcome back, everyone. Some interesting stuff I want to go into today. I want to talk about where things are heading with the financial crisis. And frankly, they're not telling you what's really happening. I did something pretty interesting, looked at something pretty interesting, which is I went through the BlackRock investment portfolio, like guide they have for investors. BlackRock, as many of you know, is like one of the main firms pushing this whole environmental social governance program. They're kind of like the World Economic Forum of investment, in terms of what they stand for. And it's interesting reading what they're stating. They're basically warning we're heading basically the 40-ish years of a stable economy they're saying is coming to an end. Those days are over. And they're saying we're entering a very volatile period where we're going to be facing a lot of real problems financially. And those are going to spill over into, keep in mind, finance is not just finance. Finance is your ability to have a home. Finance is your ability to put food on your plate. Finance is your ability this coming winter, which is going to be a real issue in Europe, to heat your home and make sure you don't freeze to death. And all of these things are going to be impacted. And it's important to note what they're saying. They're saying something interesting. Now, this report that I went through with BlackRock, a lot of media quoted it, but they, funny enough, quoted a quote that wasn't in the report. The quote most commonly used by most news outlets was not even in the report itself. But I found something else very interesting, and I assume most journalists didn't even read it when they wrote their articles. They're saying that a new regime is intentionally, well, the word they use is deliberately causing recession. Get that? BlackRock itself says a new regime is, quote, deliberately causing recessions. And I want to go over what they're saying today and go into what exactly is happening with the economy and what we can expect. Also, what this ties into as well is really an agenda, let's be clear, and an agenda that ties into everything we've been talking about yesterday's episode, an agenda that includes kind of the great transition, I believe, as Biden phrases it. And one of the big points with that, with banking and finance, is going to be the Federal Reserve pushing this new digital currency, which they're also moving forward with. I want to show you some new information on that and what they're doing exactly and what that means for us. Also, folks, we're going to have a special guest on today. We're going to have on Matthew Tierman. He's an investigative journalist, and he's going to give us some updates on what's happening in Brazil. There were pretty credible rumors that Bolsonaro was going to basically activate the military and, end communism and so on, right? It doesn't look like that's happening right now. Lula was sworn in, but there's brewing protests and instability. And given the Brazilian constitution, there's still a chance the military could intervene, and they actually might. But we will see what happens. I'm going to bring on Matthew Tierman today. He's going to talk to us about what's happening. He has some great sources in Brazil, probably one of the best connected guys in the West on this. So stay tuned for that. If you have questions too, bring your questions with you. All right, folks, that said, those of you on YouTube, keep in mind, folks, on YouTube, we could not post on Crossroads for the past week plus because we had a retroactive strike. So if you're wondering where we were, we couldn't post on YouTube. If that happens in the future, please come find us on Rumble, Facebook, or Twitter, or come join us on Epic TV where I do the full episodes. All right, folks, that said, again, I'll cut to Epic TV after 25 minutes, and I do an hour and a half show, so come join us. All right, let's start from the top. I want to talk about BlackRock, and I'm going to show you their actual report. This is the 2023 Global Outlook, a new investment playbook, and this is from BlackRock itself, straight from the horse's mouth, you could say. And it says this: the Great Moderation, the 4-decade period of largely stable activity and inflation, is behind us. They're defining the last 40 years of the American economy as being the Great Moderation, a time in our economy when things are relatively stable, and they're stating that is now over. That has come to an end, folks. The new regime, they say, of greater macro and market volatility is playing out. A recession is foretold. Central banks are on course to over-tighten give that over-tighten policy as they seek to tame inflation. We laid out in our 2022 mid-year outlook why we had entered a new regime and are seeing it play out in persistent inflation and output volatility. Central banks pushing policy rates up to levels that damage economic activity, rising bond yields, and ongoing pressure on risk assets. Central bankers won't ride to the rescue when growth slows in this new regime, contrary to what investors have come to expect. They are, get this, they are deliberately causing recessions by over-tightening policy and to try to rein in inflation. That makes recession foretold. So, I want to be clear, this is from BlackRock, folks. BlackRock is probably the furthest left investment firm there is. Yeah, WL Zim, you're noting BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, all connected to part of the new regime. That's the irony of it, is they're talking about this new regime like they are kind of the new regime. I'm going to explain to you what they're actually saying, but let me just read a bit more. It says, our bottom line, they go a bit further into it. What worked in the past won't work now. The new playbook calls for a continuous reassessment of how much the economic damage being generated by central banks is in the price. That damage is building. In the U.S., it's most evident in rate-sensitive sectors. Surging mortgage rates have cratered sales of new homes, and they point to a chart. They say we also see other warning signs, such as deteriorating CEO confidence. They say delayed capital spending plans and consumers depleting savings. People are running out of money. In Europe, they say, the hit to economies from the energy shock is amplified by tightening financial conditions. The ultimate economic damage depends on how far central banks go to get inflation down. I won't go over the whole thing they lay out, but they point to a few different factors with this. Obviously, they're not really saying it, but there's runaway government spending. The United States is still issuing budgets that spend more money than they're taking from us. The federal government is taking more money from us than probably any point in history. And even with all the money they're taking from us, they are still spending beyond their means. In other words, they're not reining in the issue you have of recession. And when you have a recession, you have to pay interest. When you overspend, you have to pay interest on it. In my opinion, interest should be illegal. Many religions forbid it. Christianity used to make it forbidden, for example, to commit usury. Islam forbids the practice of this as well. I know Judaism, among Jews at least, they forbid it as well. They can do it to other people, but among themselves, it's forbidden. This is an issue you have and of course it's in many parts of the world as well. But this is an issue you have is when you enter recession and you're paying money not because it's going to anything of value, but instead to pay the interest on debt. The interest America is now paying on its debt is more than our defense budget. We are paying more money in interest to the centralized banking system than we spend on our entire defense budget. And rather than try to pay off that debt, which means spending below our means and leaving a bit of money aside to actually pay that debt, they're spending above our means still and increasing that debt and increasing that interest rate. We're entering a state where a lot of your tax money is not even going to things that benefit you. A lot of your tax money is doing nothing other than going to pay the interest on debt. And let that sink in. You know, a large percentage of the money you pay in taxes is not going to services, not going to schools, not going to defending the country, not going to anything that benefits you. It is going to pay the debt on. It is going to pay the percentages on debt, on money because of, again, government overspending. And given this as well, they're still spending billions and billions of dollars, sending billions to Africa, sending billions to the Middle East, sending billions to Ukraine and other countries. Agree with that or not, but they're spending like it's going out of style rather than pay it back. And this is causing a few issues at the same time. That is one issue. The other issue, of course, is the fact that, well, even though there are other agendas at play with the energy sectors, they're still pushing this green agenda. That green agenda is beginning to break the energy sector. And of course, they blame the war in Russia, the war between Russia and Ukraine, as being a big factor in this. If you were to read BlackRock's investment, for example, they're saying that Russia is basically the cause of the whole energy thing. You could debate it both ways. Of course, you do have the intentional destruction of the energy markets. What the vibe I get, the feeling I get from reading a lot of these reports, is that they were actually planning on strangling out the energy sector in general, but they wanted to transition it to renewable energies and so on. Russia was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. It pushed it too far, and so the transition period they had planned and the carefully laid plans of mice and men did go awry because of that. And what's happening now is Europe basically they're risking freezing to death. You're going to have serious energy issues there that are going to cost people their lives. That's going to impact the U.S. to some extent, not as bad as Europe especially. But you're going to have real serious energy problems that begin becoming a life-threatening issue in some countries. A lot of Europe is now moving away from green energy because of that. And so the green energy agenda is actually failing right now because people are dying. People are risking dying of the cold. And take that as well with, the of course shutdown of the economic sectors because of COVID-19, shipping crisis, and the other crisis we're seeing brewing from that is kind of a we're seeing the domino effect. We're seeing a domino effect of the problems that were started at the beginning of COVID-19. Again, it was very carefully laid plans, the best laid plans of mice and men, as I said. And what you're watching right now is the domino effect of people making less money in business, shipping crisis, international shipping crisis, strangling out supply chains, and people beginning to have less money to spend on goods. You're now seeing people's pocketbooks become much thinner. People have less money to spend. Businesses start going out of business. You have roughly now 40% of businesses unable to pay rent. That means as businesses go out of business, as people lose their jobs, they're going to have less money to pay for heating, less money to pay for gas, for transportation, for basic goods, which is going to impact even more of the markets. And this is the way that the house of cards is beginning to fall. Now, I want to look at the direction the central banks are heading in with this because they are planning on using this to their own advantage. And part of that's going to be, of course, the digital currency. And this is being framed as a type of monetary totalitarianism. This is essentially a way for the centralized banks to overpower even governments in some regards. This will give central banks the power of government. And they're also talking about the new Fed pivot, which is going to be a key part in all this as well. You're watching right now a shift in power structures, in other words. And one of the big questions now is going to be, how do governments stand up amid this shift? And who's going to be the one that rises to power through it? I'm going to detail this to you all and give you kind of a clear picture, kind of between the lines of what is happening. All right, folks, before we go further, we do have a sponsor today. Speaking of recession, as we've been talking about, inflation is going to continue and likely increase, and American Hartford Gold may have some of the solution to that. Even Fed Chair Powell is warning us to brace ourselves, and there's a way to hedge against inflation. American Hartford Gold makes it simple and easy to diversify your savings and retirement accounts with physical gold and silver. With one short phone call, they can have physical gold and silver delivered right to your door or into your IRA or 401k. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A-plus rating from the BBB and thousands of satisfied clients. If you call them right now, they'll give you up to $2,500 of free silver and a free safe on qualifying orders, so don't wait, call them now. That's 877-260-2764, 877-260-2764, or text Joshua to 65532. Again, that's 877-260-2764, or text Joshua to 65532. And big thanks out to American Hartford Gold for sponsoring today's episode. Briefly on that as well, gold and silver tend to be relatively stable, but there's some people messing with the markets on it right now. Part of that is because they call whales, essentially people, kind of the big movers. We don't know, it's not clear who they are. There are a few groups that are massively buying up gold right now. It is unknown who those buyers are. I've been trying to find it. I know other people are trying to research it. We don't know who they are. It's suspected that it might be some nation state. China's suspected, Russia is suspected, but we don't actually know. Someone is trying to buy up the gold right now, and with good reason, with very good reason, actually. I think any investment firm probably should be buying it up if they know what they're doing, because again, it tends to be stable, and when you're entering an unstable and very unpredictable economy, gold and silver tend to be pretty much the best bets. But aside from the point, it's not a good way to make a lot of money. Gold and silver, just based on it, it's typically not a good way to make a lot of money unless you're looking at like total like Great Depression collapses. But it is a good way to protect against inflation, because as they increase inflation, the value of paper money, fiat currency, goes down typically, but gold and silver will mostly stay the same. Not totally, but for the most part. Let me go a bit deeper into what's happening though right now. Aside from that point, the Mises Institute, Ludwig von Mises, of course, kind of the main challenger of Keynesian welfare economics, and a school of economics I tend to like, the Mises, Ludwig von Mises' theories on it. The Mises Institute has some interesting ideas on what's happening right now. They're talking about the Fed pivot. And they're noting that the among investors right now, there's kind of a growing obsession with this so-called Fed pivot. This means this is referring to the Federal Reserve basically making a pivot on the economy. And they note where that pivot is heading. They're arguing that pivot specifically looks like it's heading towards, well, probably digital currencies. But let me explain a bit of what they're talking about. They say in a recent Bloomberg article, a group of economists voiced their fears that the Federal Reserve's inflation fight may create an unnecessary deep downturn. However, the Federal Reserve does not create a downturn due to rate hikes. It creates the foundations of a crisis by unnecessarily lowering rates to negative territory and aggressively increasing its balance sheets. The Federal Reserve is, in my opinion, one of the most corrupt institutions on the face of the planet. But tying this into, aside from my personal views, tying this into what BlackRock Investment is saying, remember the quote from BlackRock was, "The ultimate economic damage depends on how far central banks go to get inflation down." And the Mises Institute is saying that basically the Federal Reserve does not create downturn due to rate hikes. It creates foundations of a crisis by unnecessarily lowering rates. They're arguing, in other words, that the method the Federal Reserve is taking to try to fix the problem is not going to fix it. It's probably going to make it worse. And so what's the solution? Is more of the thing that damages it in the first place? What is the purpose then? They're saying it is the malinvestment and excessive risk-taking fueled by cheap money that lead to a recession. Those same economists probably saw no risk in negative rates and massive money printing, because they're printing money nonstop, and every time they print a new dollar, it lowers the actual value of the dollar in your pocket. They are robbing you. In other words, every time they print money, they are robbing you, because they're lowering the value of the money you have. Money represents fiat currency, printed money, paper money, right? Paper money. It's a banknote, and it represents a set value held within the bank. When they print money, the set value held within the bank does not go up. It stays the same. But the paper notes that represent it increase, meaning if they double the number of paper notes representing that static value, it means the paper notes themselves reduce in value. If you double the amount in circulation, you reduce the value of those paper notes by half. Even though the bill in your pocket may still say 20 or 100, in reality, the value has been reduced. This is one of the great deceptions of fiat currency. But the Mises Institute states, right, further in, it is profoundly concerning to see that the experts who remained quiet as the world accumulated $17 trillion in negative yielding bonds and central banks' balance sheets soared to more than $20 trillion, now complain that rate hikes may create a debt crisis. In other words, they're gaslighting us. My new favorite word, gaslighting. The central banks are gaslighting us. It says the debt crisis, like all market imbalances, was created when central banks led investors to believe that a negative yielding bond was a worthwhile investment because the price would rise and compensate for the loss of yield. A good old bubble. Further in, they state, now many market participants want the Fed to pivot and stop hiking rates. Why? Because many want the easy multiple expansion carry trade. Tells you an immensely perverse incentive monetary policy tells you what an immensely perverse incentive monetary policy is and how poor the macro and earnings outlooks are. I'll explain what this means in a bit. Further, it states, few of us seem to realize a Fed pivot is a bad idea, and in any case, it will not be enough to drive markets to a bull run again because inflationary pressures are stickier than what consensus would want. Stagflation. They state further in, that is the risk ahead. Inflation and recession simultaneously. Both a recession and inflation, meaning you're entering recession, right? You're entering recession where there's a financial crisis. People have less money. You're entering inflation as well, where the money is worth less. In other words, it's a crisis that's not going to resolve itself in the way that either of those would normally resolve itself. It's going to be worse than either of those individually. Worse than recession, worse than normal inflation. And they said a Fed pivot would do nothing to bring markets higher in that scenario. Stagflation periods have proven to be extremely poor for stocks and bonds. And it's interesting because, basically BlackRock is saying buy bonds. The Mises Institute is saying the bonds are actually risky as well right now. And they state even worse when governments are unwilling to cut deficit spending. As I mentioned, they're still spending like there's no tomorrow, meaning they're not resolving the problem they're creating in the first place. They're not taking steps to actually fix the cause of the problem. Imagine a person with a gunshot wound and they're bleeding everywhere. And rather than patch up that bleeding and stop the bleeding and try to heal it, they're putting bandages on other parts of the body and saying, look at how we stopped the bleeding. The bleeding is coming from the overspending. They're not fixing it. In some ways, they're reshooting the victim and causing more of the very problem while saying, maybe if we do more of this, it's going to fix the problem. It's not fixing it. And they're stating this, that because they're not unwilling to cut deficit, the governments are not willing to cut deficit spending because the crowding out of the private sector works against a rapid recovery. They want to look good on the books, in other words. And it says further in, to cut inflation drastically, 3 things need to happen, and only one is not enough. Hike rates, reduce the balance sheet of central banks meaningfully, and stop deficit spending. And unfortunately, as they note, this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. What does that mean? The solutions are not going to solve the problem. The solutions, I should say. In other words, the things that they're telling us they're doing to fix the problems are not going to fix the problems. More likely, they're gonna make it worse, and it's going to impact us as individuals more so than anything. Remember, the Federal Reserve right now is talking about intentionally causing unemployment. In their own words, and I did a previous episode on that. The Federal Reserve also cannot do enough on its own. And so while everybody's saying, hey, Fed, raise interest rates, fix our problems, save us from our own designs. Again, you have government overspending. You have government policy and financial policy making the problem worse. And while they're refusing to back off their policies, both the bad energy policies, where they're strangling out energy, the food policies and other things that are strangling out businesses, they're also massively overspending. And as they massively overspend, they're increasing the national debt. The national debt has interest rates. The Fed is increasing the interest rates. They're stealing more money from that, thereby making the problem increasingly worse. This is a manufactured crisis, folks. And it seems the Mises Institute and BlackRock do see one thing eye to eye, at least. And what they do see eye to eye is this is deliberate. This is being done knowingly and intentionally. And that raises, I think, a deeper point with this, which is, if they're doing it intentionally, what's the agenda? If they're doing it knowingly, and I believe they're doing it in a way. Where they know also that the remedy they're proposing is not working. They're the salesman of the snake oil medicine, going town to town, saying, "Look at how we can fix all your illnesses. Just one drink of this snake oil will fix everything." The snake oil doesn't work. They know it doesn't work. They're selling it to you regardless. They're trying to tell you this is the solution to all your problems. The question is, what do they have to gain from it? Of course, the snake oil salesman is just scamming people. I think there's something much greater with this. And I would say that we can look at what they call the Great Transition. We can look to that as giving us an idea of what the agenda is. Sylvia mentioned the Great Reset. Remember as well, BlackRock Investment, Vanguard, these investment firms that know what they're doing, they're deeply tied in with that whole agenda as well. They know what they're doing. And I would agree with most of you saying that as well, that this does seem to be tied to the Great Reset idea. And part of this as well is digital currencies, especially when you get to centralized banks. Because remember, the centralized banks right now are being able to play the lead role. The centralized banks, through the use of a digital currency, will become maybe not as powerful as governments, but they will wield some level of government power. Remember, central banks are not fully government. They're not fully in the United States, for example, the Federal Reserve is technically not federal. You do have some federal oversight with it. You do have some kind of public-private merging, but it's not federal. It's not part of the government, technically. And it's like that as well with a lot of countries, other than maybe China, where the Bank of China, which is doing their digital currency, their state-run, of course. What does that mean? It means that an outside force, unelected officials, will soon have the power to monitor every single purchase you make, will soon have the power to control the systems that monitor every purchase you make, and will soon be able to have a form of governance through the use of capital. This is a type of totalitarianism I don't think we've ever witnessed before. And I want to explain to you what that is. For that, though, let's jump over to Epic TV. Folks, I'm going to go into what's happening right now with the digital currencies, how they are, in fact, moving this forward right here in the United States and in many parts of the world. There's a lot going on that I have not talked about previously. I want to detail some of that with you. I also want to go into some of what's happening in Europe, because I think they've actually broken the system, and they're trying to move forward with their agenda and realizing in some regards they can't, because they broke the system. Things happened that I believe they did not anticipate, and it's breaking faster than they can keep up. They're risking a collapse, in other words, which actually may be a saving grace in some regards, although it's going to be a very painful and tragic saving grace in terms of the human impact. I'm going to detail this to you. And then we, of course, have our guest, Matt Tierman, coming on as well to talk about Brazil, so stay tuned for that. Come join us on Epic TV for the rest of the episode. Before we jump over there, I spoke with Dr. Aaron Kheriaty recently. You might have seen the part one of the video where we talk about, well, COVID policy and so on, and actually how it mirrors a lot of what the Nazis did. Part two, we go into the actual agenda when it comes to technocracy and the other things like that, and where COVID policy is taking us. I think this is an important episode as well when it comes to understanding the direction we're heading in as a society. Again, I've been touching on so many points with this, but when it comes to COVID policy and the medical establishment, there is an agenda there as well. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty details it. Let me show you a quick trailer of that. Then we'll jump over to Epic TV.
There are strong forces pushing us in the direction of a biosecurity paradigm of governance that entails inventing and reinventing new crises to maintain and fuel this biosecurity regime on an ongoing basis. What's been in development for 20 years and was rolled out opportunistically during the pandemic is not just a novel method for trying to control an infectious disease, but really a novel paradigm of governance, a paradigm of governance that rests upon the legal mechanism of the declared state of emergency. So public health proved to be a very useful means of getting the population to do what health officials and other people in power wanted them to do.
Again, folks, it's Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, part 2 of the interview we did last week. Don't miss it. It's going to be airing tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. An important episode, I think. All right, folks, that said, come join us in Epic TV for the rest of the episode. I want to go into a lot still, so come join us. See you there. And folks, thank you for being here. Also, those of you curious, I'm drinking ginseng tea today.